Hook, Camilla Varese set the wedding ring on the kitchen counter like it was a piece of garbage she was done touching. She's gone, Camilla said. She wasn't looking at Vittorio. She was checking her nails. Finally, I was starting to think you'd never get rid of her. Vittorio stood in the doorway of his own kitchen. The house was completely silent. Not the kind of silence that meant Elena was asleep upstairs or reading in the garden. This was the silence of empty closets and stripped shelves, of a life erased overnight. His eyes moved from the ring to the bare counter to the window above the sink, where Elena used to keep a small pot of basil because she said it made the kitchen smell alive. Pot was gone. Camilla was still talking. Something about finally having him to herself, about the baby not being a problem anymore, about how much easier everything was going to be now. Vittorio wasn't listening. He was looking at the ring. And for the first time in 15 years of running the most feared criminal organization in the city, Vittorio Moretti felt something he didn't have a name for. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you stories about power, betrayal, and the things people do when they think no one is watching. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning had started like any other. Vittorio had left the house at 11 the previous night, telling Elena he had business. A meeting with the Ferraro family over territory disputes in the South District. Serious enough that she wouldn't question it. She never questioned his business. That was one of the things he had always counted on about Elena, her discretion, her patience, her willingness to accept whatever explanation he offered and not push. He had driven to Camilla's apartment on the west side of the city, where the building had a private underground entrance, and the concierge had been paid enough to forget faces. He had stayed until 4 in the morning. When he arrived home just before sunrise, the house was dark and the front door was locked, which was normal. Elena sometimes locked it when she went to bed early, leaving his key on the hook inside the mudroom. Key was there. Everything looked normal. He went upstairs without turning on the lights. He was tired and slightly drunk and didn't want to wake Elena, who was 7 months pregnant and sleeping badly as it was. He undressed in the dark, climbed into bed, and was asleep inside of 4 minutes. He slept until 10. When he reached across the bed, the other side was empty, which was also not unusual. Elena had been waking earlier than him for the last 2 months, some combination of discomfort and anxiety that she never fully explained. He had never asked her to explain it. He showered. He dressed. He went downstairs, expecting coffee. The kitchen was empty. Not just Elena already ate and went outside empty. Empty in a way that registered in his chest before his brain had processed it. The small ceramic bowl she kept by the stove for olive oil was gone. The photographs she had stuck to the refrigerator with Magnet's her mother. A picture of the two of them from a trip to the coast 3 years ago. A sonogram of the baby, all of it gone. The magnets were still there, scattered across the bare refrigerator door, like punctuation from a sentence that had been erased. He stood there for a long moment. Then he saw the ring. It was sitting on the counter beside the sink, next to nothing, pointing at nothing. Just a gold band, catching the morning light through the window where the basil pot used to be. He picked it up. It was still warm from wherever she had left it. He was still holding it when Camilla called. She had driven over, she said, because she'd been worried about him, because he'd seemed distracted the night before, because she wanted to make sure he was all right. He hadn't told her to come. She had come anyway. When she walked into the kitchen and saw his face, she said, "What happened?" He held up the ring. Camilla looked at it. Then something shifted in her expression, not concern. Exactly. Something closer to satisfaction, which she dressed up quickly as sympathy before he could read it clearly. She left, Camilla said. She left. That was when Camilla made the mistake she would spend a long time regretting. Maybe it was the morning light. Maybe it was the fact that she had been waiting 2 years for exactly this moment and couldn't quite contain it. Maybe she simply forgot for one critical second who she was standing in front of. She set her bag on the counter. She looked at the ring in Vittorio's hand, and she said, "She's gone, finally. I was starting to think you'd never get rid of her." Kitchen went very quiet. Vittorio looked up from the ring. His eyes moved to Camilla's face slowly, with the kind of precision that his lieutenants knew to be afraid of the stillness before the order, the flat assessment before the consequence. Camilla felt it. She reached for something to say. "I just meant now you don't have to pretend anymore. We can..." "Get out of my house," Vittorio said. His voice was completely level. Camilla blinked. Vittorio, get out. She got out. He spent the first hour telling himself it was temporary. A reaction, an overreaction. Elena was pregnant and emotional and had probably gone to stay with her mother or with Bianca Rinaldi, her friend from university who lived in the east part of the city. She would be back by evening. She would need her doctor, her bed, the nursery they had spent 3 weeks setting up together after she had finally convinced him that they needed to actually prepare the room instead of assuming someone else would handle it. He went upstairs to check the nursery. The room was as empty. Not just cleared, systematically emptied. The crib was gone, disassembled and removed. The dresser they had bought together in September, the one Elena had spent 45 minutes debating over in the shop, while he stood by the door checking his phone, gone. The mobile with the small wooden birds, the one she had ordered from a craftsman upstate and waited 6 weeks to arrive, gone. The walls still had the pale yellow paint she had chosen. That was all that was left. Vittorio stood in the doorway of the empty nursery for a long time. His phone buzzed. It was Romano, his head of security, calling for the third time about a shipment issue in the port district. Vittorio sent it to voicemail. He called Elena. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her recorded voice was calm and professional. You've reached Elena. Leave a message, he called again. He texted, Where are you? No response. He called her mother's house in Palermo. Elena's mother, Grazia, picked up on the second ring and said, in the particular tone of a woman who knew more than she was letting on, Vittorio, can't help you. Then she hung up. He stood in the hallway with his phone in his hand and understood, for the first time, that this was not an overreaction. Elena had planned this. He assembled his core team in the study by noon. Romano, his security chief, former military, humorless, efficient, the person Vittorio trusted most in a practical emergency. Sal Greco, his fixer, who had handled 1,000 problems over 20 years, and who sat with his hands folded in his lap and his expression carefully neutral. And Leo Caruso, his lawyer, who had arrived with a briefcase and a look on his face that suggested he already knew this was going to be complicated. She's not at her mother's, Vittorio said. She's not at any of the places I know about. Her phone is off. She took everything from the nursery. He laid the facts out like a situation report, because that's how he processed things logically, sequentially, without sentiment. Romano said, She has people who would help her. The Rinaldi woman. Find her. I can have someone at Rinaldi's address within 20 minutes. Do it. Romano stepped out of the room. Sal Greco said nothing, which was typical. Leo Caruso cleared his throat. Vittorio, the lawyer said, before you escalate this, it's already escalated. My wife is missing. Your wife left, Caruso said carefully. There's a distinction. Vittorio looked at him. Caruso held the look. He was one of the few men in the city willing to do that. If Elena left voluntarily, and from what you're describing, it appears she did, then finding her through your men and bringing her home is not a domestic matter. Potentially a crime. She is a private citizen. She has rights. She is my wife, and she is pregnant with my child, which means she has even more legal protections, not fewer. Caruso set his briefcase on the edge of the desk and opened it. I need you to understand the position you are in before you do anything that makes it worse. My position is that my wife is gone. Your position, Caruso said, removing a folder, is that you are a man with your particular history, your particular associations, and a pregnant wife who has apparently left of her own accord. If she has contacted an attorney, and I strongly suspect she has, then anything you do in the next 48 hours will be documented and used to establish a pattern of behavior in any subsequent legal proceeding. The room was quiet. Vittorio said, You think she's already talked to a lawyer? The nursery, Vittorio. She took everything from the nursery. That is not an impulsive decision made in the middle of the night. That took planning, coordination, probably storage. She has been preparing this for weeks, possibly longer. Caruso closed the briefcase. Yes, I think she has already spoken to an attorney. Vittorio turned to the window. Outside, the garden was bright in the late morning light. Elena had planted things along the far edge. He couldn't remember what, exactly. He had never paid much attention to the garden. She had asked him once if he wanted to help her plant it, and he had said he was busy, which he was, and she had said okay in the tone she used when she meant something else. He thought about that now. Find Bianca Rinaldi, he said. Find out where Elena is. Don't approach Elena. Don't touch Elena. I just need to know she's safe. Romano from the doorway said, Understood. Bianca Rinaldi's apartment was a dead end. Romano's man reported back within an hour. Rinaldi was home, had answered the door, had said with complete composure that she hadn't spoken to Elena in 2 weeks and that she had no idea where she was. The man noted that Rinaldi had said all of this without making eye contact and had closed the door before he could follow up. She's lying, Romano said. Obviously, Vittorio said. But we can't push her. He was thinking about what Caruso had said. Pattern of behavior. Documentation. He was not accustomed to operating within those constraints. His entire professional life had been built on the understanding that constraints were for other people. Sal, who had been silent through most of the morning, said, "There's a detective, Hale, Marcus Hale. He's been building a file on your organization for about 18 months. Vittorio didn't look up. I know who Hale is. He called Romano this morning. Before all this, he said he wanted to schedule a conversation about a separate matter. His word separate. He didn't elaborate. That's a coincidence," Vittorio said, in the tone that made clear he didn't believe in coincidences. "Probably," Greco said, "but it's worth knowing." Vittorio thought about Elena standing in some unfamiliar house, 7 months pregnant, with his ring on a kitchen counter. He thought about the nursery walls, still yellow, and the mobile with the wooden birds that some craftsman had made by hand, now presumably in a box somewhere. He picked up his phone and called Camilla. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been sitting with the phone in her hand since he'd told her to leave. "Did you know?" he said. Silence on the line. "Then know what? Did you know she knew about us?" Vittorio. "A yes or no?" A long pause. "I suspected." "There were things," she said. "Once. I didn't know for certain." "When did she say it?" "About a month ago. I ran into her at the pharmacy near your house. She looked at me. She didn't say anything direct. She just looked at me. And then she said, 'Enjoy it while it lasts, Camilla.' And she walked away." Vittorio closed his eyes. A month ago. Elena had known for at least a month, possibly longer. Had known. Had said nothing to him. Had smiled at dinner. Had talked about the baby's room. Had painted the walls yellow. And had been systematically moving every piece of her life out of his reach the entire time. She knew, he said. Not to Camilla. To no one in particular. He hung up. The call from Leo Caruso came at 3 in the afternoon. "She's filed," Caruso said. "Petition for divorce and full custody of the child after birth. Filed this morning at 9:15. Vittorio was silent. The custody petition cites irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, documentation of an extramarital affair, and a claim of emotional neglect sustained over the course of the marriage. She has a family attorney named Garland, Meredith Garland. She's very good, Vittorio. She doesn't take cases she doesn't win." "What documentation?" Caruso paused. "Hotel records, dated photographs, some correspondence. Possibly more. We won't know the full extent until discovery." "How long has Garland been involved?" "I don't know. Given the scope of what Elena has prepared, I would estimate at least 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe longer." Vittorio sat with that, 6 to 8 weeks, while he'd been sitting across from Elena at dinner, while she had been going to her prenatal appointments, while she had been pretending that everything was the way it had always been. He thought about the expression on her face during that time. He tried to reconstruct it. He couldn't. He realized he hadn't been paying close enough attention to know what her expression had looked like 6 weeks ago, or 8, or longer. That realization landed harder than the divorce filing. "What are my options?" he said. "Right now? Don't make anything worse. The only option. If you locate Elena through your men and approach her, it will be used as harassment. If you make any attempt to contact her beyond legal channels, it will be documented. If you attempt to freeze joint accounts," Caruso paused. "She's already moved her portion. The accounts she had legal access to. She did it correctly. There's nothing actionable. She thought of everything. She did." Caruso sounded almost respectful. The woman was thorough. Vittorio looked at the wedding ring, which he had left on the kitchen counter where Camilla had put it. He hadn't been able to pick it up again. "Find me a private investigator," he said. "Someone good. Someone who can find a location without leaving a trail I can't control. Not to approach her. Not to bring her back. I need to know she's somewhere safe." A pause. "I know someone. Dante Rusk. He's expensive and he's effective. I'll make the call. Do it." Dante Rusk had the particular kind of face that made people trust him, which was professionally useful and felt personally irrelevant, because he didn't care if people trusted him. He sat across from Vittorio in the study that evening and listened to the situation with the attentiveness of someone billing by the hour. "One missing person," Rusk said when Vittorio finished. 7 months pregnant. Last confirmed location this house, sometime between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. She had help. Transportation, storage. Probably a prearranged safe location outside your known territory. Correct. Rusk looked at his notes. The friend Rinaldi. You said your man spoke to her, and she was evasive. She's involved. Definitely. But she won't lead us directly to Elena. She'll know to stay clean. Question is who else Elena used. Medical care is your best angle. 7 months pregnant. She'll need a new OB practice. She'll need to establish care somewhere. That's a paper trail she can't avoid. Can you follow it? It takes time. And it takes discretion. Because if she or her attorney gets wind that someone is tracing her medical records, it will be immediately characterized as intimidation of a pregnant woman, which plays very badly. Rusk set down his pen. I need to understand something before we proceed. What do you want when I find her? Vittorio looked at him. Because those are two different jobs, Rusk said. Finding a location and what happens after those are not the same thing. I need to know which one you're hiring me for. I want to know she's safe, Vittorio said. Rusk studied him. That's what people say. I need to know if that's what you mean. The question was so direct and so stripped of deference that it hit Vittorio differently than he expected. He was not accustomed to being questioned like this. He ran his hand along the edge of the desk. That's what I mean, he said finally. Rusk picked up his pen. Then I'll find her. Give me 72 hours. The 72 hours were the longest of Vittorio's life, which was saying something given the life he had led. He couldn't sleep in the bedroom. He told himself it because he was working late calls to the port district, the situation with the Ferraro family, the ordinary business of running what he ran. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. The bedroom felt wrong. The whole house felt wrong. It had an acoustics problem now, an echo in the rooms where Elena's presence had apparently been doing more structural work than he had ever noticed. He sat in the study until 3 in the morning. Romano brought him coffee. Sal Greco came and went. Leo Caruso sent documents. On the second night, Romano knocked and said, Hale called again. What does he want? He wouldn't say. But he said it wasn't about the organization. He was specific about that. Vittorio looked up. A detective who'd been building a case against him for 18 months, calling to say it wasn't about the case. That was either a lie or something worse. Tell him I'll call him tomorrow, Vittorio said. Romano nodded and left. Vittorio looked at the wall of the study for a long time. On the shelf to his left was a framed photograph from their wedding, Elena in white, laughing at something someone had said, caught mid-law with her eyes slightly closed. He couldn't remember the photographer taking it. He couldn't remember what had made her laugh. He had not spoken to her directly in 3 days. He was beginning to understand, spoken to her in any meaningful sense in much longer than 3 days. Rusk found the safe house on the morning of the 3rd day. Property outside the city, a converted farmhouse on about 4 acres, owned through a holding company that turned out to be registered to Bianca Rinaldi's sister-in-law. Rusk sent the address with a note, location confirmed. Subject is there. Appears secure and cared for. I recommend no direct approach. Vittorio read the note twice. Then he called Caruso. I found her. Vittorio, I'm not going to hurt her. I'm not going to drag her home. I just need to see that she's all right. Caruso was quiet for a moment. If you approach that property, I know. Your parental rights, your legal standing in the custody case, any goodwill you might generate by following the process correctly, all of it goes if you show up at that house uninvited. I know. Then don't go. Vittorio looked at the address. He looked at the wedding ring still sitting on the counter, which he still hadn't moved. I'll let you know, he said. He drove toward the safe house alone. He did not call Romano. He did not take security. He took the car he kept in the secondary garage, the one that wasn't registered in a name anyone associated with him, and he drove himself, the way he had driven when he was 23, and had nothing and no one watching his movements. He was not going to storm the property. He was not going to force the door. He told himself he just needed to see the place, to know it was somewhere decent. He pulled off the road about 100 meters back from the property line and sat for a few minutes looking at the farmhouse at the end of the lane. The windows were lit. There were 2 cars parked near the house. Someone had put a planter near the front door with something green in it. Then the front door opened. Elena stepped outside. She was wearing a gray sweater and dark pants, and her hands were in her pockets against the morning cold. She stood on the step for a moment, just breathing the air, and then she looked up the lane the way people look when something inside them tells them to look, and she saw his car. She looked directly at the car. Then she looked at him through the windshield, across the distance. Vittorio got out. He was not sure why he did it. He had intended to stay in the car, but he got out and stood beside the car and looked at her. Elena didn't move for a moment. Then she took her hands out of her pockets and stood fully upright, one hand resting over her stomach, not dramatically, not deliberately, just the way she had been doing it for months. The gesture of a woman reminding herself of something. He started walking up the lane. She watched him come. When he was close enough to see her face, clearly really see it, the way he had been failing to see it, for a long time he stopped walking. She looked exhausted, not just pregnant tired, exhausted in the bone-deep way of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of sustained will and is running low on the reserves that take. But she also did not look afraid. Elena, he said. She said nothing. I just needed to see you were safe. Her expression shifted. Something that was almost a laugh without any humor in it. You needed to see I was safe, she repeated. Vittorio, I have been standing right in front of you for years. You didn't see me then. The words landed with the precision of someone who had been thinking about exactly what to say and had decided on the truth. He said, I know. She looked at him steadily. Then you know why I'm not coming back. Elena, I am not going to raise our child in that house, she said. I am not going to raise our child in a marriage where I am the last thing you notice when you walk into a room. I am not going to explain to our daughter or our son what their father's absence means and then watch you walk back in and expect gratitude for showing up. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't crying. She was just stating facts, the way someone states facts when they've already done all the crying they're going to do on the subject. I understand, he said. No, she said, you don't. Not yet, but you might. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, go home, Vittorio. The lawyers do their work. If you actually want to be part of this child's life, then show it the right way. Not by driving out here alone and standing at the end of my lane. Car that had been parked near the house started its engine. She turned toward it. Elena, he said. She stopped but didn't turn back. I'm sorry, he said. She didn't say anything. She walked to the car, got in, and it drove around the side of the property. Vittorio stood alone at the end of the lane. The morning was very cold. The planter by the front door had some kind of small herb in it. He still couldn't identify it from here. Behind him, his car was running. Ahead of him, the farmhouse door had swung half closed in the wind. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around and drove back to the city. He drove slowly. He took the long route. He wasn't ready for the house yet, for its specific silence, for the yellow nursery and the refrigerator magnets arranged over nothing, and the ring on the counter that neither of them had touched in 3 days. He drove, and he thought about what she had said. You didn't see me then. And the thing that kept circling, the thing he couldn't outrun on the long route back, was the realization that she was right. Not right the way an accusation is right, where you can locate the defense and the extenuating circumstances, and the version of events where you don't come out the worst. Right in the simple, unargued way of a fact. He had looked at Elena every day for years and had not seen her. He had confused her stillness for contentment, her patience for acceptance, her willingness to manage his house and carry his child and make her small complaints without pressure for something that meant she was fine. She had not been fine. She had been watching and waiting and preparing to leave, and he had not noticed any of it. He pulled over on a side street, 2 miles from the city center, and sat with the engine running. Romano called. He declined it. Caruso called. He declined that too. He sat with his hands on the wheel and looked at nothing, and did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He thought about who he had actually been to the woman carrying his child, and he didn't like what he found. The car was warm. Outside the city moved around him, trucks and people, and the ordinary noise of a day continuing regardless. He could hear his own breathing. Somewhere across the city, in a farmhouse with a planter by the door, Elena was doing what she had been doing for months, managing without him. Put the car in gear. He drove home. The ring was still on the counter. Picked it up this time. He stood in the kitchen with it in his hand, and he didn't know what to do with it. So he just held it, this small gold circle that had meant something once, that he had treated like a given, that Elena had left behind like the answer to a question he should have been asking a long time ago. Outside, the city hummed and moved and didn't care. Inside, the house was very quiet. And Vittorio Moretti, who had spent his entire adult life making sure that he was the most dangerous thing in any room he walked into, stood alone in his kitchen holding a ring that no longer fit anyone's finger and understood, for the first time, that the most important battle of his life was one he had already been losing for years without knowing it was happening. He put the ring in his jacket pocket. That was the first thing he did the morning, after he drove back from the farmhouse. He picked it up off the counter where it had been sitting for 3 days, and he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and he didn't explain to anyone why he did it. Romano noticed everything, but he didn't ask, which was why Romano had lasted 22 years in a business where most men lasted 4. The second thing Vittorio did was call Marcus Hale. Hale answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for the call. Cops who had been waiting for a call always answered on the second ring, fast enough to signal availability, slow enough to signal they weren't desperate. Moretti, Hale said. You called twice, Vittorio said. You said it wasn't about the organization. It's not. Then what? A brief pause. I'd rather do this in person. I'd rather not. Another pause, longer this time. Hale was deciding something. It concerns your wife, or your situation with your wife, and what it means for you going forward. Vittorio kept his voice flat. You've been watching Elena. I've been watching you? Elena became relevant recently. Hale's voice was careful, the way a man is careful when he's holding something he doesn't want to drop. I'm not your enemy in this, Moretti. I know how that sounds coming from me. But what I have to tell you isn't something I can say on the phone. We're neutral ground. The coffee place on Aldrich. 11. Vittorio looked at the clock. It was 8:40. Fine. He hung up and looked at Romano, who was standing in the doorway, pretending to look at something on his phone. Don't follow me, Vittorio said. Romano didn't look up. Of course not, Romano. I said, of course not. Hale was already there when Vittorio arrived, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall, which was what men in both their lines of work instinctively did. He was in plain clothes, a gray jacket, no tie, and he had a coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, built like someone who had once been in much better shape and was doing a reasonable job maintaining what was left. He had the eyes of a man who had been watching bad decisions for 30 years and had developed a professional relationship with disappointment. Vittorio sat down. He didn't order anything. Hale said, I'll get to it. Please. I've had surveillance on your household rotating. Not intrusive for about 14 months. You know this. I assumed it. 6 weeks ago, one of my people observed Elena Moretti meeting with an individual I didn't recognize at a cafe on the east side. The meeting lasted about 40 minutes. She paid cash. She left separately. Hale wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I ran the individual. He turned out to be a paralegal at Garland Family Law. Told me something was in motion. Vittorio waited. I kept watching. Not Elena, I have no interest in Elena. People around you. And about 3 weeks ago, one of your associates made contact with a man named Fierro. Benny Fierro. You know that name? The name registered in Vittorio's chest like a wrong note. Where did you hear that name? From my surveillance. Hale finally lifted his coffee. Fierro is a private debt collector. He specializes in pressure. The kind of pressure that doesn't leave paperwork. He set the cup down again. The associate who contacted him, I'm not going to tell you which one, not yet, because I want you to think carefully about who in your organization knew about Elena's plans before you did. The cafe was warm and smelled like ground coffee and something baking. 2 older women at a nearby table were talking about something that made them laugh periodically. None of it registered. You're telling me, Vittorio said slowly, that someone in my organization hired Fierro in connection with Elena. I'm telling you that contact was made. I don't have a confirmed contract. But Fierro doesn't take social calls. When? The initial contact was about 10 days ago, before the divorce filing. Vittorio looked at the table. 10 days ago, Elena had been at the farmhouse for 3 days, which meant that 10 days ago, she had not yet left. She had been in his house, 7 months pregnant, going through the ordinary motions of a day, and someone in his organization had been making contact with a pressure man. Who knew she was planning to leave, Vittorio said. That's the right question. Hale pushed his coffee to the side. I'm not here to build your case against your own people. That's your business, and I don't want it. But I'm telling you this because whatever happens in that custody fight, it goes badly for everyone if a pregnant woman gets hurt. And I mean badly in ways that go beyond the legal. He met Vittorio's eyes. I need you to understand that I will not be able to protect you from what follows if something happens to Elena. Not from the law and not from other things. Nothing is going to happen to Elena, Vittorio said. Then find out who made that call and shut it down. Today, not tomorrow. Vittorio stood up. Moretti, Hale said. Vittorio looked at him. She's in a decent place, the farmhouse. The area's clean, the roads are safe, and Rinaldi checks on her regularly. He said it without expression, which was almost kind. I thought you'd want to know. Vittorio walked out without answering. He drove 3 blocks and then pulled over and sat in the car with both hands flat on the steering wheel. Someone in his organization had called Benny Fierro. He ran the calculation. Who knew Elena had been preparing to leave? Not Romano. Romano would have told him immediately, if only out of professional obligation. Not Caruso. Caruso's entire value was in his loyalty and his fear of exposure. Not Del Greco, who had been with him since the beginning and whose self-interest was entirely tied to Vittorio's continued operation. Who else had access to the house? Who else would have noticed what Elena was doing? Who else had something to gain from the marriage ending and something to lose from it ending cleanly? The answer assembled itself before he finished the question. Called Camilla. She answered immediately again. He was already tired of how quickly she answered. Did you contact anyone about Elena? He said. No preamble. Silence. Then what do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Did you make any calls? Give anyone any information? Ask anyone to do anything? The silence this time was different. It had a texture to it. Camilla. I didn't hire anyone, she said, too fast. Too specifically worded. But you talked to someone. I was worried. I told you that. I was worried about what she might do, what she had on us on you. I talked to Enzo. I just talked to him. I asked him if there was anything that could be done. Torio's hand tightened on the phone. You talked to Enzo Mare. He's helped before with things that needed to be quiet. Enzo Mare. He said it again because he needed to hear it out loud. Enzo Mare, who had been with the organization for 11 years, who managed the Northern Territory, who had been in the room for any number of conversations he should never have been in. You went to one of my lieutenants and asked him to do something about my pregnant wife. I didn't say that. I didn't say anything like that. I just asked if there was a way to manage the situations. Stop talking, Vittorio said. She stopped. Do not call anyone. Do not call Enzo. Do not call anyone else. Do not leave your apartment until I contact you. Do you understand me? Vittorio, do you understand me? Yes. Her voice had gone very small. He hung up. Enzo Mare was at the northern warehouse when Vittorio arrived. He was sitting in the back office, going through manifests, sleeves rolled up, reading glasses on the end of his nose, looking for all the world like a middle manager doing inventory. He looked up when Vittorio came in, and his expression registered the appropriate surprise and deference before something else moved quickly behind his eyes and was gone. Vittorio had known Enzo for 11 years. He had eaten at his table. He had been at his daughter's christening. He knew what Enzo's surprise looked like when it was real. This wasn't it. He sat down across from Enzo and said nothing for a moment, just looked at him. Enzo set down the manifest, took off his glasses, folded them on the desk. You drove up yourself, he said. No, Romano. Just me. Enzo nodded slowly. He was 61, heavy, with the careful stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was safer than movement in certain kinds of conversations. He had a scar on his jaw from something that had happened before Vittorio's time. His hands were flat on the desk. Camilla called you, Vittorio said. She did. What did she ask you? She was upset. She wanted to know if there was a way to Enzo stop. Chose different words. She was concerned about what Elena knew, about the exposure, my exposure. Enzo looked at him steadily. All of our exposure, Vittorio. A divorce proceeding that involves your finances, involves all of our finances. You know that. So this was about protecting the organization. It was about protecting what we've built. Vittorio looked at his hands. Did you contact Benny Fierro a beat? Enzo said, I made an inquiry. Nothing was contracted. Nothing was authorized. You made an inquiry to a pressure man about my pregnant wife, about the situation. Not about Enzo stopped again. Say the sentence, Vittorio said quietly. Enzo's jaw tightened. I was exploring options, that's all. Nothing happened. Nothing was going to happen. You don't get to decide that. Vittorio kept his voice completely, even because raising it would feel like relief, and he didn't want relief right now. He wanted Enzo to sit in the full weight of what was being said, without the cushion of Vittorio's anger to hide inside. You made a call to a man who hurts people on behalf of people who pay him, and you aimed that call in the direction of a woman who is carrying my child Enzo. Enzo's eyes dropped to the desk. Look at me. Enzo looked at him. You will call Fierro, and you will make clear that there is no situation, there is no inquiry, there is nothing. You will do it today, in the next hour. And then you will stay in this building, and you will wait. Vittorio, You will stay in this building. He stood up. I need to think about what else you owe me. He walked out. In the car, driving back south, his hands were very steady on the wheel, which was how he knew how angry he was. Vittorio Moretti's hands were always steadiest when he was at the outer edge of what he could contain. Romano called. Vittorio answered this time. In Zomare, Vittorio said. Pull everything he's done in the last 6 weeks. Every call, every contact, every meeting not logged. I want it on my desk tonight. Romano said nothing for a moment. Then, how far do you want me to go? Far enough to know exactly what he did and exactly who else was involved. And Camilla Veriz? Vittorio watched the city past the windows. She stays put for now. I'll deal with her separately. He hung up. Leo Caruso arrived at the house at 6 with papers and a look on his face that suggested the day was about to get measurably worse. He sat down across from Vittorio and arranged the papers on the desk without being asked, which meant they were something Vittorio was going to need to read rather than have summarized. Garland filed supplementary documentation this afternoon, Caruso said, Elena's attorney. Vittorio looked at the papers. She is more than I thought, Caruso said. A lot more. The papers were organized into sections. Vittorio went through them with the reading discipline of a man who had spent 20 years going through contracts that contained things designed to be overlooked. He didn't skim, he read every line, hotel records. 16 separate occasions over a period of 22 months, with dates, location names, duration of stay. Credit card records from accounts Vittorio had assumed were private. Photographs taken from a distance, grainy but identifiable, of Vittorio entering and exiting Camilla's building on 8 separate occasions. Printed messages from a secondary phone he had used for communication with Camilla, which meant Elena had had access to that phone at some point, or had hired someone who did. There were also financial records, transfers, some that Vittorio had made, and some that he had authorized others to make on his behalf. Transactions that, laid out in sequence, the way Garland's filing laid them out, told a story about money that Vittorio did not want told in a courtroom. He set the papers down. How did she get the phone records, he said. I don't know. But she has them. The messages are selective, nothing that touches the business directly. She or Garland was smart enough to pull only what serves the custody case. She's been building this for longer than 6 weeks. Yes. Caruso's voice was careful. I think she may have started collecting documentation very shortly after she found out about the affair, which, based on what you've told me, was at least several months ago. Vittorio thought about Elena at the pharmacy, saying to Camilla, enjoy it while it lasts. How calm she'd been. How certain. Not the words of a woman in the first shock of discovery. The words of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do and had started doing it. She had been building a case against him. While living in his house, sleeping beside him, attending her prenatal appointments, painting the nursery yellow. She had been patient in a way he had never given her credit for being. Patient and systematic, and far more aware of his world than he had ever assumed. What does the financial documentation expose, he said. Caruso pressed his lips together. In the custody context, it demonstrates a lifestyle funded through sources that a family court will want explained. Garland is not alleging criminality she doesn't need to, for her purposes. She just needs to demonstrate that the environment Elena and the child would be returning to is one of significant instability and risk. And what does the court see when they look at that argument? They see a pregnant woman who left a powerful man with documented reasons and went to a safe location. And they see that man's associates making contact with pressure men. Caruso met his eyes. The Fierro inquiry, Vittorio, how exposed is that? Hale knows about it. Caruso closed his eyes briefly. Opened them. How much does Hale know? He knows contact was made. He told me before I knew myself. Then Garland may know within the week. Her connections to law enforcement on these kinds of cases are... Caruso stopped. It will appear in the supplementary filing, if it does. And at that point, the custody question becomes considerably less competitive. Vittorio looked at the hotel records on the desk. 16 occasions. 22 months. He hadn't counted it out like that before. He sat with the number. I need to know something honestly, he said. When do you not? Caruso said, which might have been a small attempt at something lighter. I follow the process. If I do everything correctly from this point forward. The lawyers. The filings? No contact. No pressure. If I do it right, what's the realistic outcome for the custody arrangement? Caruso was quiet for a moment. She has primary. That's almost certainly not contestable at this point. The documentation is too extensive, and the circumstances of your lifestyle are too present. He folded his hands on the desk. The realistic outcome, if you do everything correctly, is supervised involvement that gradually expands as you demonstrate stability. It is not a fast process. It is not a comfortable process. And it requires you to accept, genuinely, and without tactical motivation, that you have caused harm, and that you are committed to something different, a genuine change. Yes, not performed for the court. Courts have seen every performance, judges especially. Caruso looked at him with something that wasn't quite sympathy, and wasn't quite its opposite. They are very good at telling the difference. Vittorio looked at the supplementary filing for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Dante Rusk. The farmhouse, he said when Rusk picked up. I need continuous passive observation. No approach, no contact. Nothing that Elena or anyone connected to her could detect. I need to know if anyone approaches that property who isn't Rinaldi or known medical. You think there's a threat, Rusk said. I think I need to be certain there isn't one. Understood. I can have someone there by morning. Tonight. A brief pause. I'll make the call. He hung up and looked at Caruso. I need a therapist, Vittorio said. Caruso blinked. Whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't that. I'm sorry? Therapist. Someone legitimate and qualified and willing to deal with someone in my situation. Someone Garland's office can verify is real. He said it without looking away. I'm not doing it for the court. I'm telling you that so you don't put it in those terms anywhere. I'm doing it because I sat in a car on a side street this morning and tried to honestly assess what kind of man I have been to that woman, and I didn't like the result. Caruso was quiet for a moment. I know someone, he said. She's good. She won't be intimidated by you. Good. Set it up. When this week? Caruso gathered his papers. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said. The fact that you can say that what you just said without it costing you visibly. That's not nothing. Vittorio didn't answer. After Caruso left, he sat alone in the study. The house had its particular silence again. He had been here 3 days and was already developing a relationship with it, learning where it gathered, which rooms held it differently, what it sounded like at the different hours of the night. He pulled the wedding ring out of his jacket pocket and set it on the desk in front of him. He had been carrying it against his chest for 2 days, without knowing exactly why. It wasn't sentiment. He wasn't sure he was capable of it in the form it was usually described. But it was something. Some residue of the person he had been at 29 when he put it on Elena's finger in a church in front of 70 people, and said words he had meant at the time. He had meant them. He had just failed to understand that meaning something and showing it were not the same act. His phone buzzed. Romano. He answered. Enzo's file is ready, Romano said. You'll want to look at it in person. How bad? The Fierro contact is the smallest thing in it. Vittorio felt the bottom of something shift. What's the largest? Romano was quiet for a moment. In 22 years, Vittorio had almost never heard Romano hesitate. He has been in contact with the Garland office, Romano said. Not recently. Months ago, before Elena left. The study was very still. Romano. I know. Enzo Mare has been feeding informations to Elena's attorney. It appears so. The contact was indirect through a third party, but the chain is clear. Romano's voice was steady, the steadiness of a man delivering a report that he knows is going to change things permanently. He knew about the affair. He knew about the secondary phone. Some of the financial records in Garland's filing, I cross-referenced them this evening. They weren't from Elena's access. They were from Enzo's access. Vittorio picked up the ring from the desk and held it. He gave Elena's lawyer the ammunition, he said. Most of it, Romano said. Elena likely had some independently. But the phone records, specifically those came from Enzo. Why? Romano said nothing for a moment. Then Northern Territory dispute. 2 years ago. You sided with the Ferraro family over Enzo's recommendation. He lost significant revenue. He's been building his own position since then. A pause. And he has been involved with Camilla Verezzi, on and off for about a year. The room tilted slightly. Vittorio set the ring back on the desk. Camilla, who had come to his kitchen the morning Elena left and said finally, who had called Enzo about managing the situation, who had apparently for the past year been managing something else entirely, with Enzo behind walls. Vittorio had never thought to look behind. He sat with it. He sat with the full shape of it, the betrayal from the lieutenant he had trusted, the parallel life his mistress had been living, the way all of it converged, at the point where Elena walked out the door, and he let himself feel the weight of it without trying to convert it immediately into action, because the weight was real, and because what he did next, with this information, would determine everything. Keep it contained, he said finally. Don't approach Enzo. Don't tip Camilla? I need to think. How long do you need? Tonight, he ended the call. The ring sat on the desk. The house sat around him. Somewhere across the city, a judge was probably reviewing Garland's supplementary filing. Somewhere north of the city, Elena was in a farmhouse with a planter by the door, doing whatever the evening looked like for her now, and someone Vittorio had trusted. For 11 years had been feeding her lawyer documents and sleeping with the woman whose presence had helped end Vittorio's marriage. Pressed his fingertips together and stared at the far wall and understood that he was standing at the edge of the one kind of decision he had never had to make before. Not a tactical decision, not a strategic one, not a decision about territory or money or loyalty in the organizational sense. A decision about what kind of man he was going to choose to be. Because he could move on Enzo the way he would move on any betrayal. That path was clear and familiar, and that consequences would be final and contained, and completely wrong in ways that would cost him every remaining chance at the thing that actually mattered. Or he could do something he had never once done in his professional life. Could let the law handle it. He picked up the phone, called Hale. Hale answered on the second ring, waiting again. I have information about who fed documentation to Elena's attorney, Vittorio said. Information that may be relevant to your investigation. Silence on the line. Then Hale said very carefully, I'm listening. Not on the phone, Vittorio said. And I want Caruso present. And I want it on record that I came to you. Another silence, longer. Hale was processing what it cost for this particular man to make this particular call. Aldrich again, Hale said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'll be there, Vittorio said. He hung up. He sat for a long time. Then he picked up the ring, put it back in his pocket, and went to stand at the window of his study, looking out at the garden in the dark, at the plants Elena had put along the far edge that he still couldn't name. And he stood there until the city's lights made the sky above the trees go the color of something almost warm. He had just done something that could not be undone. And for the first time in 3 days, his hands were not completely steady. Hale was already at the corner table when Vittorio walked into the cafe at 8 the next morning. Caruso was 2 steps behind Vittorio, briefcase in hand, moving with the careful energy of a man who had spent the night, deciding how to manage something he hadn't expected to be managing. Hale had brought someone. A woman late 40s, dark jacket, a notepad already open on the table in front of her. She didn't introduce herself immediately. She looked at Vittorio the way investigators look at people they have read extensively on paper and are now calibrating against the physical reality. Vittorio sat down. Caruso sat beside him. This is Detective Sora Vance, Hale said. She handles financial crimes. She's been working adjacent to my investigation for about 6 months. Caruso said, we weren't advised there would be a second party present. I'm advising you now, Hale said. Vittorio looked at Vance. She had the settled patience of someone who had learned to wait out power. He said, fine. Caruso opened his briefcase. Vittorio laid it out the way Romano had laid it out to him without editorializing, without the anger that was still very present and very contained, just the sequence of facts. Enzo Mare. The contact with Benny Fierro. The parallel involvement with Camilla Varese. The channel through which financial documents and phone records had reached Meredith Garland's office before Elena had even filed for divorce. When he finished, the table was quiet. Vance had been writing steadily. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, she said, the third party that Mar used to pass documentation to Garland's office, do you have identification on that individual? My security chief has a name. I can have it to your office within the hour. We'll need the documentation chain itself. Not your interpretation of it, the raw records Romano pulled. Can be arranged. Hale was watching Vittorio with the expression of a man who was revising something. Not his opinion, his calculation. You understand, Hale said, that what you're giving us potentially opens doors we have been trying to open for 18 months. I understand that, and you're doing it anyway. Vittorio looked at him. My wife is in a farmhouse north of the city, 8 months pregnant, because someone in my organization decided his interests were worth more than her safety. I am doing it because the alternative is handling it myself, and I am choosing not to. Hale held the look. Why? Because my child is going to grow up in whatever world I make right now. He said it without ornamentation, and I would like that world to be one where I didn't handle it myself. The table was quiet again. Vance put her pen down. We'll need 24 hours to verify the chain independently before we move on Mare. Can you guarantee he stays in place, doesn't run? Romano will manage that, without Enzo knowing he's being managed. Camilla Varese? She stays put, she's not going anywhere. Vance looked at Hale. Something passed between them, the shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to communicate without the inconvenience of words. Then she looked back at Vittorio. We'll be in contact through Mr. Caruso's office. Hale said, one more thing. Vittorio waited. Garland's office received something this morning. A supplementary package not from Mare's channel. Different source. Hale's voice was level in the way it was when he was watching for a reaction. We intercepted a copy through a parallel channel we have on Garland. The package contains testimony. Written testimony from Camilla Varese. The cafe was warm. The two women from the day before weren't there. A young man at the counter was talking to the barista about something that made them both smile. Camilla gave a statement to Elena's attorney. Vittorio said, voluntarily it appears. Filed 2 days ago, before you told her to stay put. Hale folded his hands on the table. We don't have the full content. But based on the filing metadata, it's substantial. Several pages. Vittorio thought about Camilla in his kitchen saying finally, Camilla calling Enzo. Camilla who had spent a year in a parallel arrangement with the man who had been feeding ammunition to Elena's lawyer. She didn't stay put, Vittorio said. No, Hale said. She did not. He walked out into the morning air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Caruso came out behind him and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Vittorio looked at the street. A bus went past. A woman with a stroller. A delivery truck reversing into an alley with that particular beeping that always sounded like an argument. How bad is the testimony, he said. I don't know yet, Caruso said. But given everything else, I think we should assume the worst and be relieved if we're wrong. They drove back in separate cars. The full content of Camilla's statement reached Caruso's office by noon through Garland's formal disclosure process, because Garland was thorough enough to file it properly and confident enough in its contents to want Vittorio's legal team to read it immediately. Caruso called Vittorio at 12:47 and said, come to my office. Don't bring Romano. Vittorio was there by 1:15. Caruso's office was on the 14th floor of a building that looked like a law office from the outside, and was in fact a law office. Caruso had been careful about that distinction for 30 years. The view was the kind that cost money. The furniture was the kind that cost more. Caruso was standing at his window when Vittorio came in, which meant he had been standing there for a while, which meant whatever was in the statement was bad enough that he needed the view to steady himself before the conversation. He turned around when Vittorio sat down. He had the statement in his hand, printed, double-spaced, 12 pages. How bad, Vittorio said. Caruso set the statement on the desk and sat down across from him. She has documented 3 specific incidents in the last 18 months, during which she claims you made statements in her presence, 2, to her directly, that she characterizes as explicit threats toward Elena in the event of a separation. Vittorio went still. She claims that you said, on one occasion, that Elena would not be able to take the child anywhere you couldn't find her. On a second occasion, that anyone who helped Elena leave would wish they hadn't. On a third occasion, Caruso stopped, looked at the page. That the child would be yours regardless of what Elena decided, and that Elena's decisions about her own life were only valid within the scope of what you permitted. The room was very quiet. Vittorio said, I never said those things. I know. I need you to hear me say that. I never made those statements. Not to Camilla, not to anyone, I believe you. Caruso's voice was careful. But what I believe and what a family court judge finds credible, based on written testimony from the documented mistress of the respondent, are 2 different things. Camilla Varese has every surface-level reason to be credible. She was in your life for 2 years. She has corroborating details about your routines and your household and your manner, and she has no obvious motive to lie that Garland won't be able to counter in court. She has every motive to lie. She's been involved with Enzo Mare for a year. She helped him feed documentation to Elena's attorney. We know that. We know it because Romano dug it up in 24 hours. But it is not yet in any official record. And if we produce that information in a custody proceeding without it being properly verified, Garland will argue we fabricated it to discredit a legitimate witness. Caruso pressed his fingertips together. We are in a difficult position. Vittorio picked up the statement. He read it. Not quickly, slowly, the way he read things he didn't want to read, making sure he caught every word because it was worse to be surprised by something later than to know it now. Camilla had written in a style that was polished enough to have been helped along. The details were specific dates, locations, approximate times, descriptions of what he had been wearing. The kind of specificity that reads as authentic even when it isn't. He set it down. She's been preparing this for a while, he said. Yes. Longer than I knew about her and Enzo. Caruso leaned forward. Vittorio, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way. Ask. Is there anything in your actual conduct, anything I don't know, anything that happened that you haven't told me that could be used to corroborate even one of these three claims? Not the precise wording, the underlying sentiment. Anything that Elena witnessed, anything another person witnessed, anything that exists in any form that could be read as consistent with what Camilla is alleging. Vittorio thought about it honestly. He owed Caruso that. He thought about the arguments there, had been arguments, in the last year especially, the kind that come from two people living in increasing distance from each other. He thought about his tone in those arguments. He thought about the moment, 8 months ago, when Elena had said she needed him to come to a prenatal appointment, and he had said he had business, and she had looked at him with an expression he hadn't bothered to decode at the time. He thought about what he had and hadn't said. Nothing that matches what she's claiming, he said. But I was not a gentleman to live with. I was not patient. I was not often kind. He kept his eyes on Caruso. I gave her reasons to be unhappy. I did not give her reasons to be afraid. That distinction matters, Caruso said. Enormously. But we have to be able to prove it. How? Caruso looked at the statement again. We need witnesses to the actual texture of your marriage. People who were in the house, in your presence, who can speak to how you actually treated Elena. We need records, Elena's own records, if possible. Messages between you that demonstrate the actual register of your communication. We need to establish that Camilla Varese has a specific interest in misrepresenting your character and your conduct. He paused. And we need to do all of this without looking like we are attacking a woman who has come forward voluntarily. Vittorio looked at the window. The city was outside doing what it did. There's one more thing, Caruso said. Vittorio waited. The therapy appointment I arranged. Dr. Marin. She had a cancellation. He hesitated. She can see you at 4 o'clock today. Vittorio looked back at him. I know the timing feels fine, Vittorio said. I'll be there at 4. Dr. Adela Marin's office was on a quiet street in the West Quarter, on the second floor of a narrow building between a bookshop and an accountant's office. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a plant that was doing reasonably well for a plant in a room with limited natural light. Vittorio sat in one of the chairs for 3 minutes before the door opened, and Dr. Marin came out to greet him. She was younger than he'd expected, early 40s, small, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at him the way someone looks when they have been told a thing about a person and are in the process of checking it against the person. She shook his hand. She had a firm grip, which he noticed. Mr. Moretti, come in. Her office was small and did not look the way he had expected. No couch. 2 chairs facing each other at a slight angle, a small table between them with a glass of water already on it. Books on one shelf. A window with the shade partially drawn. He sat down. She sat across from him, crossed her legs at the ankle, and put a legal pad on her knee without opening it. Leo Caruso told me your situation, she said, generally. I don't need the specifics today, if you'd rather not. What do you need today? To understand why you're here. Not the legal reason. The actual reason. He looked at her. I was honest with Caruso. I'll be honest with you. I sat in a car 3 days ago and tried to honestly assess what kind of man I had been to my wife. I didn't like what I found. What did you find? That I had spent years living beside her without seeing her. That I confused providing for her with caring for her. That her patience with me was something I had come to expect without ever earning it. He said it without looking away. That I had failed her comprehensively and had not noticed because the failure was quiet. Marin wrote something on the pad. Not much, a few words. Looked back up. And what do you want from this process? To understand how I got here. To understand it well enough that I don't repeat it. Court? For my child. She looked at him for a moment. Those aren't mutually exclusive, I know. I'm telling you it's for the child because that's the truth. And I don't want you thinking I'm performing something. Do you often worry about being mistaken for someone who's performing something? He thought about it. No, I don't usually care what people think I'm performing. But you care now. Yes, she wrote a little more. Why? He thought about the question. Outside faintly, a car passed on the street below. Because the people who matter, Elena, my child, I've already given them every reason to believe the performance is all there is. I need there to be something real underneath it, even if I can never convince them of it. The office was quiet. Marin looked at him steadily. We can work with that, she said. Romano called at 5:40 while Vittorio was driving home. Enzo knows, Romano said. The words hit the inside of the car like something thrown. How? Vittorio said. I don't know yet. Someone tipped him. He's not at the warehouse. He left about 2 hours ago, told one of his people he had business in the North District, but didn't specify. He hasn't been reachable since. Vittorio thought about Vance saying 24 hours to verify independently. It had been 20 hours. He's running, Vittorio said. It looks like it. He took his personal vehicle. His wife says he told her he'd be back tonight, which is either true or the lie he told her. Find him. Don't stop him. Don't approach him. Just find him and keep eyes on him until I tell you otherwise. There's something else. Romano's voice shifted slightly, the very specific shift of a man delivering news he would rather not be delivering. When he left the warehouse, he made a call. We were monitoring his line. The call was brief, 40 seconds. To who? To a number registered to a prepaid phone. The prepaid is unregistered, but the cell tower ping puts the receiving phone in the area of Romano stopped, where Vittorio said, the area north of the city, within about a 3-mile radius of the farmhouse. The car felt very cold suddenly. Vittorio said, get Rusk on the phone right now, Romano, and call Hale. He was already accelerating. Rusk answered on the first ring. I've got eyes on the property, he said without preamble, which meant he'd been watching his phone and had seen Romano's incoming call. 2 vehicles, both known Rinaldi's car and the nurse Elena's been using for home appointments. No new arrivals in the last 4 hours. There's a prepaid phone that pinged in your vicinity in the last 2 hours. Someone Enzo Mara called when he ran. A brief silence. Then, I'll expand the perimeter. I have someone on the road that comes in from the east. I'll get someone on the western approach as well. Nobody comes near that property without me knowing about it first. Understood. He hung up and called Hale. Hale picked up mid-first ring this time, past the pretense of the second ring delay. Mar ran, Vittorio said. He made a call to an unregistered phone that pinged near Elena's location. Hale said something quietly to someone in the room with him. Then I'm putting a unit on the road north. Plainclothes, 2 cars. Can you get someone to the property itself? I can have a patrol car do a welfare check. It won't look like protection, it'll look routine. Do it. Do it now, Hale. He drove north. Told himself he wasn't going to the farmhouse. He told himself he was just getting closer, just closing the distance so the response time was shorter if something happened. Just being practical. He drove north and told himself these things, and mostly believed none of them. His phone rang. Unknown number, he answered. Vittorio, a woman's voice. Low, careful. It took him 2 seconds, then Bianca. Elena's all right, Bianca Rinaldi said immediately. It's fine, but you need to know something. Tell me. There was a man on the road about a 1/4 mile from the property. He was parked. He's been there for about an hour. He's not one of Rusk's people. I recognized Rusk's car from last week. This is someone different. What does he look like? She described him. Mid-50s, heavyset, scar on the jaw. Vittorio's hands tightened on the wheel. It was Enzo. Enzo Mare was sitting on the road outside Elena's farmhouse. Not approaching. Not acting. Just sitting there in the way of a man who was deciding something, or waiting for something, or both. Vittorio said, Is Elena inside? Yes. She's been inside all afternoon. She doesn't know. Keep her inside. Lock the doors. I'm 20 minutes out, and so is law enforcement. He paused. How did you get this number? Elena has it, Bianca said. She's had it the whole time, in case of emergency. A brief silence. She said she hoped she'd never have to use it. He drove fast. He called Rusk and gave the description and the location. Rusk said his man on the eastern approach had already noted the parked vehicle and was maintaining observation from a distance. He had not moved. 17 minutes later, Vittorio turned onto the road north of the farmhouse and saw the plainclothes police units, 2 dark sedans, parked at angles that were professionally casual and completely obvious if you knew what you were looking for. Enzo's car was gone. He pulled over, called Hale. He moved when the units arrived, Hale said, followed him. He's pulled over on the county road about 2 miles east. My people are with him. He's not going anywhere. A pause. He was alone. He was unarmed, far as we can tell. But he had a phone and he'd been making calls. To who? We're working on it. Vittorio sat in his car on the road, with the farmhouse visible at the end of the lane. Planner was still by the front door. A light was on in one of the front rooms. Through the window, very faintly, He could see the shape of someone moving Bianca, probably, or Elena the ordinary movement of a person, inside a house they thought was safe. He sat there. His hands were shaking, not much, not visible to anyone outside the car. But he could feel it, the fine tremor of adrenaline, and something else, something that didn't have a clean name, that lived in the gap between what could have happened and what actually had. Phone buzzed. Caruso, he answered. I just got off the phone with Garland's office, Caruso said. His voice had the flattened quality of someone who had just received information they are still processing. They wanted to flag something. A contact attempt. Garland was contacted. Her office was this afternoon. Someone called and identified himself as representing Vittorio Moretti's interests. Caruso paused. Caller suggested that Elena's attorney might want to consider the costs of continuing to pursue the current filing, that there were other ways for this matter to be resolved. The shaking stopped. Vittorio went completely still. That call was not from anyone you authorized, Caruso said. It was not a question, no. Garland has already reported it to the family court. It will be characterized as witness intimidation and intimidation of legal counsel. It goes on the record tonight. Caruso's voice was steady and grave. Vittorio, I need you to tell me right now, with complete honesty, that this did not come from your organization in any capacity. It came from Enzo Mare. You're certain? Hill's people have him on the county road 2 miles east of Elena's location. He was parked outside her property for over an hour. He made calls from an unregistered phone. Vittorio looked at the farmhouse. He has been running his own operation inside mine for 2 years. He is not acting on my behalf. He has not been acting on my behalf. He has been acting against me and against Elena while using my name as cover. Caruso was quiet for a long moment. The call to Garland's office if it's attributed to your organization in court, regardless of the actual source. I know. Your legal standing in the custody case. I know, Leo. Silence. Then we have to get ahead of it, Caruso said. Tonight. I call Garland directly. I explain that we have law enforcement already in contact with the individual responsible. I provide Hale's name as verification, and I request an emergency session with the court tomorrow morning to address the record. Do it. There's a cost to this, Caruso said carefully. Going directly to Garland, giving her Hale's information, it's a significant step. Positions us as cooperating with the investigation in ways that have implications beyond the custody case. I know what it implies, Vittorio said. You understand what you're authorizing. I understand that the alternative is letting a man who's been betraying me for 2 years take down my ability to be a father to my child. Yes, do it. He heard Caruso exhale a very small sound, quickly controlled. I'll make the call. The line went quiet. Vittorio sat in his car on the road outside the farmhouse for a few more minutes. The light in the front room was still on. No movement visible now. He thought about Elena inside, not knowing any of this had happened. Not knowing that the man who had helped build the case against Vittorio had also been sitting outside her house tonight. Not knowing how close the evening had come to being something entirely different. He thought about his child, the shape he had seen on the sonogram. Elena had put on the refrigerator and then taken with her when she left the image that was now somewhere in that farmhouse in a folder with her other documents. He thought about what Marin had asked him. Why do you care now? He hadn't answered her fully. He had talked about the child, which was true, but there was something else underneath it that he hadn't been able to name in her office and was only able to name now, sitting in the dark on a road outside a house where Elena was managing without him. He cared because it was the only thing left that was real. The empire was real in a way that had a price tag and a consequence. The organization was real in the way of a machine that ran on loyalty and fear and ground through the people inside it, including him, including Enzo, including everyone who had ever thought they controlled it, instead of the other way around. But this, the light in the farmhouse window, the child on the sonogram, the woman he had failed to see for years, this was the only thing that had a future that wasn't also a threat. Started the car. He drove back south. He did not stop on the side road this time. He drove straight home, walked straight into the study, and sat down at the desk where the wedding ring was still sitting. He picked it up. He held it in his palm and looked at it in the light, and he said, to no one, to the empty room, to the specific silence of a house that had stopped being a home before he'd noticed it happening, all right. That was all. Just all right. Like a man who has been losing a war he didn't know he was fighting, finally turning to face the field and deciding that the way forward is not through, but through something else entirely. Something slower, harder, and without the certainty he had spent his whole life using as a substitute for courage. He set the ring down. He picked up his phone. He called Romano and told him to give Hale everything, every record, every contact log, every piece of documentation that connected Enzo Mare's parallel operation to the events of the last 2 years. Romano said all of it. All of it, Vittorio said. He hung up. The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved in the dark, and somewhere north of the city, in a farmhouse with a planter by the door, Elena put her hand over her stomach and felt the baby move, and did not know that the man she was divorcing had just made the hardest decision of his life and handed over the keys to his kingdom to keep her safe. The emergency session was set for 9 in the morning. Caruso had made the call to Garland's office at 11 the previous night, and Garland had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which Caruso told Vittorio was the most unsettling thing about the conversation. When Garland spoke, she asked 2 questions. She asked for Hale's direct contact. She asked whether Vittorio Moretti was prepared to submit a formal declaration to the family court, attesting to the unauthorized nature of the call made to her office. Caruso said yes to both. Garland said she would see them at 9. Vittorio didn't sleep. He sat in the study until the sky outside went from black to the particular gray that precedes morning. And he drank 2 cups of coffee that Romano brought him, and read through every document Caruso had flagged as relevant to the next day's session. He read them with the discipline of a man who understood that the ground he was walking onto in that courtroom was not ground he had ever been trained for. His preparation for every other room in his life had been about leverage and information, and the clear understanding of who held power and who did not. This was different. In this room, the power moved in ways he couldn't bend. Romano checked in at 2 in the morning. Enzo Mare had been taken to a police station in the North District for questioning. He had not yet retained an attorney, which Romano described as either stupidity or a specific tactical choice. Hale's people had pulled the prepaid phone records. The calls Enzo made from outside the farmhouse were to 2 numbers. One was Fierro confirming the original connection. The second was unidentified and still being traced. Vittorio told Romano to go home and get some sleep. Romano said he would, and didn't. At 6:30, Vittorio went upstairs and showered, and put on the suit Caruso had recommended, dark, conservative, nothing that read as money displaying itself. He stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom for a moment. He looked like himself. He looked like a man who had not slept and was going to a proceeding that could determine how much of his child's life he would actually be present for. He went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and ate nothing because he was not capable of it. 7:45, Caruso arrived, and they reviewed the declaration together for the final time. Caruso had written it in language that was precise without being legalistic, the language of a man making a statement, not performing one. Vittorio read through it and changed 2 words and signed it. They drove to the courthouse. The family court session was in a smaller room than Vittorio had imagined. He had imagined something formal and weighted, something with the physical grammar of consequence. What he got was a conference room on the 3rd floor with a long table, fluorescent lighting, and a judge named Reyes, who was somewhere in his late 50s and who looked at Vittorio the way men who have seen a great deal of a particular type of person look when they encounter that type, with recognition rather than judgment, but without warmth. Garland was already there with Elena's local counsel and a younger associate who was taking notes before the session officially started. Garland herself was in her 60s, short, with gray hair cut close, and the particular stillness of someone who had stopped needing to signal competence through movement. She looked at Vittorio when he came in and gave him a nod that was neither hostile nor welcoming. It was the nod of someone who had assessed him and was waiting to see if the assessment held. Elena was not present. Caruso had confirmed this in advance. She was in her 3rd trimester, and her OB had recommended against the stress of the session. She was represented by her counsel and would be informed of the outcome. Judge Reyes opened the session by stating that he had reviewed Caruso's emergency notification and the documentation submitted by both parties through the night, and that he wanted to establish several things for the record before they proceeded. He was methodical. He had Vittorio's signed declaration entered. He had Hale's written statement submitted through proper channels at 5 in the morning, which meant Hale had been working through the night as well entered. He looked at both documents and then looked at Vittorio. "Mr. Moretti," Reyes said, "you are attesting under penalty of perjury that the contact made with opposing counsel's office yesterday afternoon was not authorized by you and was not made by anyone acting at your direction. Yes, Vittorio said. And you are further attesting that the individual you have identified as responsible, Enzo Mara, was acting against your explicit interests and in coordination with other parties in a manner that has been reported to law enforcement. Yes. And law enforcement has confirmed independent contact with this individual. Detective Hale's statement confirms that. Reyes looked at the statement. He looked at Garland. Counselor. Garland said, "We have reviewed Detective Hale's statement. We have also reviewed the documentation provided by Mr. Moretti's security personnel regarding Mare's contact with the firm." She paused. "We are satisfied that the call to our office did not originate from Mr. Moretti directly." The room was quiet. However, Garland said, "The word landed in the room with the weight of something placed deliberately." However, she continued, "The call was made using Mr. Moretti's name. It was made by an individual who has been part of Mr. Moretti's organization for 11 years. It was made in the context of an established pattern of organizational conduct that this filing has documented extensively." She looked at Reyes, not at Vittorio. "The question before this court is not whether Mr. Moretti personally picked up a phone. The question is what kind of environment this child would be entering, and what the realistic expectations are for that environment's stability." Reyes looked at Vittorio's counsel. Caruso stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. He laid out the timeline of Vittorio's cooperation with law enforcement. He introduced the therapy documentation 1 session, a start, characterized as exactly that. He addressed the Fierro contact, the Mare situation, the Camilla Varese testimony, working through each element with the care of someone, dismantling a structure from the inside. He did not minimize anything. He did not suggest that Vittorio was misrepresented or misunderstood. He argued, very specifically, that a man who had done what Vittorio had done in the past 72 hours was not the man described in the filing, or rather, that he was no longer only that man. When Caruso sat down, Garland asked 2 questions. First, has Mr. Moretti had any direct contact with my client since the divorce filing? Caruso said, 1 incidental visual contact at the property where she is residing, in which Mr. Moretti did not enter the property and did not attempt to compel her return in any way. Visual contact, Garland said. He drove to her location. He did, Caruso said. He has acknowledged that this was not correct conduct. He has not repeated it. Garland wrote something. Second question. The financial documentation in the supplementary filing the transactions my office has characterized as demonstrating significant instability in the household environment. Mr. Moretti has not challenged those documents. That's correct. So the financial picture stands. We are not disputing the transactions, Caruso said. We are disputing the characterization. Garland looked at Reyes. I think the characterization speaks for itself, Your Honor. Reyes looked at Vittorio. He had the expression of a man who had heard a great deal and was now making a determination that he had probably already arrived at before the session started. Mr. Moretti, he said, I'm going to ask you directly. Counsel. You, Vittorio said, go ahead. Why should this court extend any parental access to you beyond what the existing order provides, given the totality of what has been filed and what occurred yesterday evening near your wife's residence? The room was very still. Vittorio looked at the judge. He thought about what Marin had asked him in her office. He thought about what he had said in the car on the roads outside the farmhouse. He said it shouldn't, not yet. Reyes blinked once. The filing is accurate in the ways that matter, Vittorio said. I was not a good husband. I was not a present partner. I provided materially and I was absent in every other way. My wife is in a farmhouse with a planter by the door because I gave her no other reasonable option. He kept his voice level. Cost him. The therapy is 1 session. The cooperation with law enforcement is 3 days old. I have no standing to ask for trust that I haven't begun to earn yet. The room was quiet. What I can tell this court, Vittorio said, is that I intend to earn it, not for legal strategy. Because I am going to be this child's father for the rest of my life, and the kind of I've been so far. The kind of father I was positioned to be before last week is not acceptable, and I am the only one who can change that. Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his documents. He ruled that the primary custody arrangement would stand with Elena as ordered. He ruled that Vittorio's contact would remain supervised and limited until a formal review in 6 months, contingent on continued therapy, continued cooperation with law enforcement, and no further direct or indirect contact with Elena outside of legally designated channels. He also ruled that the Camilla Varese testimony would be held in an evidentiary hearing separate from the custody matter, pending the investigation into its accuracy. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was exactly what Caruso had told him to hope for: a door left open, 1 inch, on the condition that he push it correctly. Garland gathered her papers. As she passed Vittorio in the doorway, she stopped without quite stopping, a half pause, barely a second, and said, quietly enough that it was only for him, "Your wife is remarkable." Then she was gone. Outside the courthouse, Caruso stood beside him on the steps in the morning air and said, "That went better than it should have." "I know. The Varese testimony hearing is the next fight. I know. If we can establish the connection between Camilla and Mare, if Hale's investigation produces what I think it's going to produce." "Leo," Vittorio looked at him. "Give me an hour." Caruso stopped. Of course. He drove. No destination for the first 10 minutes, just the city, moving through it the way you move through something you need to feel around you when the alternative is being still. Then he found himself heading west, and he followed it until he was in the neighborhood where he had grown up, the part of the city he had left at 19, and only returned to when something in him needed the specific gravity of where he had started. He parked on a street he recognized. The buildings were the same and completely different, the way places are when time has passed, and you have changed more than the place has. He sat in the car and looked at the end of the block where there used to be a hardware store. His father had taken him to every Saturday morning. It was a phone repair shop now. He thought about his father. Not often. His father had died when Vittorio was 26, before the organization was what it became, and the man had not been the kind of father who invited thinking about, but he thought about him now. About the specific way his father had treated his mother, not with violence, nothing dramatic, just with the particular carelessness of a man who had never considered that the people around him needed to be noticed. Vittorio had looked at that and decided he would be different. He would be more successful, more powerful, more capable of providing. He would give his family everything his father had failed to provide, and he had never stopped to notice that the thing he'd replicated, the specific carelessness, the failure to see the person standing right in front of him, was exactly what he had decided not to carry forward. He sat with that for a long time. His phone rang. It was Hale. "We got the second number," Hale said. "The unidentified call from Mare's prepaid, outside the farmhouse. Whose name won't mean anything to you. He's freelance industrial disputes, sometimes personal. He was contracted for physical relocation. The terminology he uses is," Hale paused. "He was hired to move someone without their cooperation. In the context of a pregnant woman at a remote property, I think we both know what that means." The street outside was ordinary and quiet. A woman walking a dog. Kid on a bicycle. The morning continuing indifferently. "He didn't move on the property," Hale said. "My units arriving spooked Mar, and the contract was called before execution. But we have the communication, we have the contract language." Another pause. "This is no longer a civil matter, Moretti. This is attempted kidnapping. Mare is looking at federal charges." "Good," Vittorio said. "It also fundamentally changes the evidentiary picture for your custody hearing. Garland's office is going to receive this documentation within the hour." Vittorio closed his eyes briefly. "Open them." "There's one more thing," Hale said. "And this one I need you to hear carefully. Tell me, Camilla Varese. We pulled her phone records as part of the Mare investigation. The timeline of her contacts with Mare goes back further than a year. Significantly further." Hale's voice had the flatness of someone delivering information that is larger than the conversation it's arriving in. "There are records of communication between Varese and Mare going back to shortly after you began your relationship with her. Early contact. Strategic contact." He paused. "We believe the relationship with you was not incidental. Street was still ordinary. The kid on the bicycle had turned the corner. The woman with the dog had stopped to let the dog investigate something near a lamppost." "You're saying she was planted," Vittorio said. "I'm saying the timeline of her contact with Mare is inconsistent with a relationship that developed naturally over time. I'm saying that the two of them appear to have been coordinating for significantly longer than either of them has admitted." A pause. "I'm saying you need to be prepared for the possibility that the affair that destroyed your marriage was something that was engineered from inside your own organization." The lamppost. The dog. The woman tugging gently on the leash. "By Enzo," Vittorio said. Enzo had motive, the territory dispute. The financial loss, the long game. Hale let that settle for a moment. "Put someone close to you who could generate the affair, generate Elena's discovery of it, generate the departure, all of which destabilized your position, and created the legal exposure that he was then in a position to exploit. Vittorio sat with it. He sat with the full weight of it, 2 years of his marriage destroyed, his wife and child driven from his house, his legal position shredded, not as collateral damage to a territory dispute, but as the intended outcome of a plan designed by a man he had known for 11 years and eaten dinner with and trusted inside the walls of everything he had built. "Does Elena's counsel know this yet?" Vittorio said. "Not yet. I'm telling you first because it changes how you approach the next phase. And because..." Hale stopped. "Because it's the kind of thing a person should know." Vittorio said thank you. He hung up. He sat in the car on the street where he had grown up for a long time. Long enough for the dog-walking woman to come back around the block, the dog now apparently satisfied with its investigation. Long enough for the light to shift. Long enough for the thing Hale had said to stop being a fact he was hearing and become a fact he was carrying. 2 years. Camilla had been coordinating with Enzo Mara for potentially 2 years. The late nights at her apartment, the particular way she had of making him feel that his marriage was a burden he had chosen, rather than a life he was responsible for. The small erosions of his attention toward Elena that had accumulated so gradually he had never noticed the direction of travel, all of it, in service of a plan designed by a man who had lost money in a territory dispute and decided that the correct response was to hollow out the man responsible from the inside. And Elena had paid for it. Elena, who had noticed the affair and said nothing, and started preparing to leave, who had built her case with meticulous patience, who had taken the baby's mobile with the wooden birds and gone to a farmhouse with a planter by the door. Elena had paid for something she had no part in creating. Started the car. He drove to Caruso's office. Caruso listened to the Hale call without interrupting. When Vittorio finished, Caruso was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "We need this in formal written communication from Hale's office before we can use it in any proceeding." "I know." The Varese hearing, if this is confirmed, the testimony she filed is not just flawed. It's part of a coordinated strategy to damage your position in the custody case. Garland will recognize that. Will Garland use it to help Elena or to adjust the filing? Russo looked at him. Garland represents Elena's interests. If it becomes clear that the breakdown of your marriage was engineered, that the affair was not purely a matter of your character. He stopped. It complicates the narrative that has been built in the filing. "It doesn't change what I did," Vittorio said. "I still made every choice I made. Enzo didn't put me in that apartment. He created the access. I walked through it." Caruso was quiet. "I need you to be clear on that," Vittorio said. "When we present this information, I don't want it framed as exoneration. I want it framed as what it is, an additional crime committed against Elena, not a reduction of my responsibility." Caruso looked at him for a long moment. "That is an unusual instruction." "Correct one. It will not maximize your position in the custody case." "I know." Vittorio, "It's the correct one," he said again. Caruso wrote something. He looked at what he'd written. Then he said, "I'll contact Hale's office for the formal documentation and present it to Garland on those terms. Today." Today, Marin's office at 4 o'clock was the same small room, the same 2 chairs, the same partial shade on the window. She had a cup of tea this time. She offered him water. He took it because his mouth was dry in the specific way it got when he had been running on no sleep and sustained tension for longer than his body liked. He sat down and told her about the morning. Not as a report the way he'd told Caruso, the way he'd told Romano, with the structure of a situation being managed. He told it the way a person tells something when they need to say it out loud to understand it themselves. She listened without writing. When he finished, she said, "How are you?" He looked at her. "That's a broad question." "It's the one I'm asking." He thought about it honestly. He stopped. Started again. "I'm angry in a way I don't know what to do with." Not at Enzo. The anger at Enzo is clean, it's what it is. At myself. He looked at his hands. I handed him the material. I gave him the affair to engineer because I was already moving in that direction. I just needed someone to open the door. You think you're responsible for his plan. I think I'm responsible for being the kind of man whose marriage could be destroyed from the inside without him noticing. He said it flatly. That's on me. Marin was quiet for a moment. That's a real thing you're saying, she said. And also it's a thing you can use to continue punishing yourself indefinitely instead of doing the actual work. He looked at her. Both things are true, she said. You were vulnerable to it because of choices you made. And someone exploited that with intention. The accountability and the injustice can coexist. She met his eyes. The question is what you do with each of them. He sat with that. The accountability, she said, you work with here, over time, with Elena's boundaries in place and your child's needs as the reference point. The injustice, she paused. That's harder, because the injustice is real and doesn't resolve neatly, and you are not someone who has much practice with things that don't resolve. No, he said. I'm not. That's what we're going to work on. He looked at the window. The shade was moving slightly, a draft from somewhere. She's going to find out, he said. About Enzo and Camilla. About the full scope of it. How do you think she'll respond? I don't know. I never knew Elena as well as I thought I did. He said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. She's stronger than I gave her credit for. She's more patient, more strategic, more he stopped. She deserved better than what I gave her. And now she's going to learn that the thing that broke us was partly manufactured. And I don't know if that helps her or makes it worse. That's her process to have, Marin said gently. Not yours to manage. He nodded. They sat for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. He reached for it. Instinctively saw Marin's eyes and put it back in his pocket. She noticed. You can check it. It can wait. She said nothing. But something in her expression shifted just slightly, just enough. He left it in his pocket. After the session, standing on the sidewalk outside Marin's building in the early evening, he checked the phone. Romano. A text forward, she's in labor. Hospital. Stood on the sidewalk. His heart, which had been running on a low sustained adrenaline for 4 days, did something that was entirely different from adrenaline. Something he didn't have a practiced relationship with. He called Romano. When, he said, about an hour ago. Bianca Rinaldi is with her. The midwife and the OB both confirmed at the hospital. Which hospital? Romano gave him the name. Vittorio stood on the sidewalk outside Marin's office with the city going past him in the early evening and his child being born in a hospital across the city and the weight of the last 4 days and the last 2 years and the last 11. Years of choices all converging on this single point. Could not go. The order was clear, no direct contact with Elena outside designated channels. A hospital room where she was in labor was not a designated channel. He stood there for a long time. Then he called Caruso. Elena's in labor, he said. I need to know what I'm permitted to do. Caruso was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. You can be at the hospital. You cannot go to her room without her consent. You cannot make contact without her consent. Can I be there? You can be there. He was in the car before the sentence finished. He drove across the city in the early dark, through the ordinary traffic of an ordinary evening, with his hands steady on the wheel and his chest doing something he didn't have language for. And the city going past the windows the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, not knowing or caring that somewhere inside it, the most important thing in Vittorio Moretti's life was happening without him. He pulled into the hospital parking structure and sat for a moment in the car. He was not going to go to her room. He was not going to send a message. He was not going to do anything except be present in the same building as the birth of his child, because it was the one thing he was permitted to do, and because for the first time in his life, permitted was enough. He got out of the car. He walked into the hospital and found a waiting area on the correct floor, not near the room, far enough back, a chair by a window that looked out at the parking structure and the city lights beyond it, and he sat down. He sat there in the fluorescent light of the waiting area, with his hands in his lap and his jacket still on, and the wedding ring in his pocket where it had been for 4 days. He sat there and he waited. A nurse passed. A family group, 3 people, anxious and quiet, sat across from him and didn't look at him. A television mounted high on the wall showed something with the sound off. He sat. An hour passed. Then Romano appeared at the end of the corridor. Romano, who was supposed to be going home and sleeping and had clearly done neither, and walked to where Vittorio was sitting and stood beside him without sitting down. She's all right, Romano said. The baby's all right. Vittorio looked at him. Bianca called my phone, Romano said. She said Elena wanted you to know. Elena wanted you to know. He sat with those words. Elena in a hospital room down the corridor, who had spent months planning her escape, who had left his ring on the counter, who had told him, at the end of a farmhouse lane that he hadn't seen her, had told Bianca to call and say she was all right. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth for a moment. Romano looked at the window. They sat together in the waiting area, the man who had run an empire and the man who had kept it running, both of them silent in a hospital corridor, and outside, through the window, the city lights did what they always did, held the dark back, indifferent and steady and burning. And somewhere down that corridor, Vittorio Moretti's child had just taken their first breath in a world that was going to be different. from the one they would have been born into 4 days ago. The baby was a girl. Romano told him at 11:47, still standing beside the chair by the window, still looking at the city lights through the parking structure glass. He said it the way Romano said everything without decoration. Just the fact delivered cleanly. A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Both Elena and the baby in good condition. Vittorio sat with it. A girl. He had not thought specifically about which. He had thought about the baby in the abstract of the sonogram, in the abstraction of the nursery walls painted yellow, in the legal abstraction of the child that appeared in every document Caruso had filed. He had not thought about a daughter. He sat in the waiting area chair until 1 in the morning when a nurse came out and told him that visiting hours were over and that he would need to leave. He left. He drove home in the dark and sat in the kitchen and did not turn on any lights for a long time. He thought about his daughter. He thought about what kind of world she had been born into, and what kind of world she was going to grow up in, and what kind of man was going to be her father, and whether those last two things could be made to match into something she would be all right with, someday, when she was old enough to understand what all right meant. He didn't sleep that night either. The Varese hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the birth. 6 weeks in which Vittorio did not go to the hospital again without authorization. Did not contact Elena outside of the formal channels Caruso had established. Did not send anything to the farmhouse, not flowers, not letters, nothing that could be read as pressure or manipulation, or the performance of a change he hadn't earned the right to claim. He went to Marin's office twice a week. He went through Romano's documentation of Enzo Mara's 2-year operation with Hale's Financial Crimes Unit, sitting in rooms with people who had spent 18 months building a case against him and answering their questions honestly, because Caruso had advised it, and because it was right, and because the two things for once aligned. He stepped back from 3 operational areas of the organization. Not dramatically, not in a way that created instability or invited challenge from other directions. Carefully, with Romano managing the transitions, he was not dismantling what he had built. He was extracting himself from the parts of it that required his personal attention in ways that made him unavailable for everything else. He learned the name of the herb in Elena's planter. Time. Romano had found out somehow Vittorio didn't ask how and told him one morning with no particular context. He didn't know why that mattered to him. But it did. At his 5th session with Marin, she asked him what he was most afraid of. He said, that I'll do everything right and it won't be enough. That I'll earn back the access and show up for the visits and be present the way I wasn't before. And she'll look at me when she's old enough to look and see the man I was instead of the man I'm trying to be. That's possible, Marin said. He looked at her. Children see both, she said, before and the after. You don't get to edit the before. You only get to make the after real enough and long enough that it becomes the dominant thing. How long does that take? Longer than you want. Less long than you're afraid of if you don't stop. She looked at him steadily. You have to stop treating it like a problem to solve and start treating it like a life to live. He sat with that for the remainder of the session and most of the drive home. The Varese hearing began on a Tuesday morning in the same courtroom where Judge Reyes had held the emergency session. Hale's investigation had produced, in 6 weeks, a body of evidence that Caruso described as comprehensive and Garland described, in a private conversation that Caruso relayed to Vittorio as disturbing. The timeline of Camilla Varese's contact with Enzo Mare had been reconstructed through phone records, financial transfers, and testimony from 2 individuals within Mare's network who had accepted cooperation agreements. The picture it produced was specific and ugly. Camilla had been introduced to Vittorio through a social connection that was on examination not accidental. The introduction had been arranged through a mutual contact who turned out to have financial ties to Mara's operation. The relationship had developed along lines that, in retrospect, showed the fingerprints of deliberate management Camilla's availability at the precise moments when Vittorio was most isolated from Elena, her specific knowledge of Vittorio's routines and vulnerabilities, the way she had, over the course of 2 years, contributed to a steady erosion of the marriage without ever appearing to push. She had been very good at it. That was the thing Vittorio found hardest to reconcile, not the betrayal itself, but the quality of it. Patience. The skill. It reminded him uncomfortably of Elena. Both women had been patient. Both had been strategic. One had used it to save herself. The other had used it in service of someone else's agenda, for money, and had probably told herself along the way that the feelings were real enough to justify the method. He didn't think about Camilla with hatred. He had expected to, and found he didn't. What he felt was something flatter and more exhausted, the specific tiredness of a man who has looked at a map of his own life and found that a significant portion of what he thought was solid ground was engineered. Camilla did not appear in court herself. Her attorney submitted a formal withdrawal of the testimony she had filed with Garland's office, citing the discovery of information that had materially affected her client's recollection of events. It was the kind of legal language that meant she knew the documentation existed and had decided that perjury charges were worse than the embarrassment of retreat. Garland presented the withdrawal to Reyes without comment. She didn't need to comment. The withdrawal of the testimony, combined with the Mare prosecution documents and the Fierro contract evidence, reframed the entire 6 months of legal proceedings in a way that Garland's silence communicated more effectively than any argument she could have made. Reyes looked at everything on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Vittorio. "Mr. Moretti," he said, "the court has reviewed the supplementary investigation materials, the withdrawal of the Verese testimony, and the 6-week compliance report submitted by your counsel." He folded his hands. "The court has also received a statement from the petitioner." Vittorio went still. From Elena, Reyes said, "Wasn't Caruso started?" "It was submitted directly through her counsel," Reyes said. "Morning. Ms. Garland received it last night." Garland, across the table, was looking at her papers. Her expression was neutral in the way of someone who has read something and is letting it speak for itself. Reyes said, "I'm going to read the relevant portion into the record." The petitioner writes, "I am not asking the court to restore what was. I am asking the court to protect what is, which is a child who deserves to know her father, and a father who has demonstrated, in the past 6 weeks, a consistency of conduct that I did not expect and cannot ignore. I am not reconciling. I am not forgiving in the way that word usually implies a return to what existed before. I am saying that the man who sat in a hospital waiting room all night without coming to my door is not the same man who drove to my property uninvited 6 weeks ago. I don't know yet what to do with that difference. But my daughter deserves the chance to find out." Courtroom was very quiet. Vittorio looked at the table in front of him. He did not trust his face right now, and he kept his eyes down until he was certain of it. Reyes set the statement down. "Based on the totality of the record, the court is prepared to modify the custody arrangement." He laid out the terms: primary custody with Elena as established, unsupervised visitation beginning at scheduled intervals, expanding on a 6-month review basis contingent on continued therapy and continued compliance, a formal communication framework established through counsel, a requirement that both parties participate in a co-parenting mediation process beginning in 60 days. He said, "The court also notes for the record that the conduct of Enzo Mare and Camilla Verese, as documented in the federal investigation materials, constitutes a significant external factor in the deterioration of the petitioner's marriage. This does not absolve the respondent of the choices he made. Court considers it relevant to a complete understanding of the circumstances." He signed the order. The session ended. In the corridor outside, Caruso shook Vittorio's hand and then seemed to realize that the gesture was insufficient and clapped him once on the shoulder instead. "She read the waiting room," Caruso said. "Bianca told her," Vittorio said. Elena decided what to do with it herself. He stood in the corridor with people moving around him, and the fluorescent lights doing what fluorescent lights do, and the modified custody order in Caruso's briefcase, and the statement Elena had written the man who sat in a hospital waiting room. "All night, without coming to my door, doing something in his chest that he wasn't going to try to name in a courthouse corridor." "Go home," Caruso said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He went home. The first unsupervised visit was on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. Caruso had arranged it through the co-parenting mediator, a woman named Forsyth, who communicated with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years managing situations in which precision was the only thing standing between people and catastrophe. The visit would be 2 hours. At Elena's house, the farmhouse, which Elena had transitioned into a longer-term rental, the planter still by the front door, the time now considerably larger. Bianca would be on the property but not in the room. Vittorio drove up alone. He had bought nothing. He had debated it something for the baby, something small and appropriate, and had decided against it because it felt like a gesture designed to be noticed rather than a thing done for its own sake. He went empty-handed. Elena answered the door. She looked different from the farmhouse lane 6 weeks earlier. Some of the sustained will exhaustion had lifted, replaced by a different tiredness, the particular depletion of new parenthood, which was real and grinding, but had something in it that the other tiredness hadn't. Something that wasn't purely cost. She looked at him for a moment. He said, "Thank you for the statement." She said, "I meant it. I know." She stepped back from the door. He walked in. The house was warm and smelled like coffee and something faintly sweet that he couldn't identify. There was a blanket on the couch, a small pair of socks on the floor beside it, a baby monitor on the side table with its green light steady. Elena said, "She's asleep. She'll wake up in about 20 minutes if you want to wait." "I'll wait," he said. She gestured toward a chair. He sat in it. She sat on the couch, not close, not positioned to create distance, just where she sat, naturally, the way a person sits in their own house. They were quiet for a moment. He said, "How are you?" She considered the question. "Tired. Good tired, mostly." She looked at the monitor. "She doesn't sleep long, but she sleeps hard, her father's daughter." He looked at her. "That's not—" She stopped, almost smiled. "Quite. I didn't mean it as anything, I know." The quiet came back. It was different from the silence of his house in the city. Silence had been the silence of absence. This was the silence of two people who had a great deal of unsaid between them, and were for once choosing not to force it. He said, "The investigation hails team. They've been thorough. I want you to know the full scope of what Enzo did, if you want to know it. Not from me directly, but through Garland and the prosecution materials. If it would help you to understand what happened." Elena looked at him. Her expression was careful, not guarded, exactly. Careful the way someone is careful with something they're not sure they're ready to handle. Garland explained the outline. "It's worse than the outline." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what it means. Whether it changes anything." She looked at the blanket on the couch, smoothed a corner of it with one hand. "And it does, and it doesn't. It means the affair it wasn't just your choice. It was a hand on your back pushing." "There was," he said. "But my feet moved." She looked at him. "I'm not using it as a reduction," he said. "I want to be clear on that. What Enzo built, he built because I gave him material to build with. The marriage was already there, was already distance, already neglect. He didn't create that. He found it and used it." Elena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I know that too." The monitor crackled. A small sound, not crying, something before crying, the particular noise of a baby surfacing from sleep. Elena stood. She went to the back of the house and came back a few minutes later, carrying a small person wrapped in a yellow blanket that was almost exactly the color of the nursery walls. She sat down on the couch. She looked at him. He looked at his daughter. She was very small. He had known she would be small. He had known this intellectually, but the actual smallness of her was something that knowledge hadn't prepared him for. She had dark hair, a little of it, and her eyes were open and moving with the unfocused attention of someone who was taking inventory of a world that was brand new to all of her senses. Elena said, "Do you want to hold her?" He said yes. He crossed the room and sat beside Elena on the couch close. For the first time in months, the physical proximity of two people who had shared a bed and now shared this. Whatever this was, and Elena transferred the baby into his arms, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 6 weeks, and the particular watchfulness of someone who was doing it for the first time with him. He held his daughter. She was warm, heavier than he expected for her size. She smelled like something clean and new that didn't have a comparison. She looked at him, or near him, the focus still developing, and he looked back, completely still. Elena was watching his face. Could feel it without looking. She was watching his face the way you watch someone's face when you need to know something about them that they can't tell you themselves. He looked at his daughter. He felt something come apart and reassemble in the space of a breath. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was quiet and thorough, and it moved through every calculation he had ever made about what mattered and rewrote the conclusion without asking his permission. He said very quietly, "Hi." The baby made a small sound. Her hand, emerging from the blanket, found his finger and held it with the reflexive grip of someone who didn't know yet that letting go was an option. He let her hold it. Elena looked away, out the window. The time was visible from where they sat, in the planter by the door, green and unremarkable and alive. They sat together in the warm room for a long time, without speaking. Enzo Mari was convicted 14 months later on federal charges that included conspiracy, obstruction, and solicitation of kidnapping. He received 12 years. His attorney argued that his actions had been motivated by financial grievance and organizational loyalty, and had not been intended to result in physical harm. The judge found the argument unpersuasive. Camilla Varese cooperated with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. She received a suspended sentence in community service. She left the city. Vittorio did not track where she went. He told Romano not to track it either. Benny Fierro was convicted on a separate solicitation charge and received 4 years. The criminal organization that Vittorio had spent 20 years building contracted significantly in the aftermath. Some of it was the Mare investigation, pulling threads that connected to other threads. Some of it was Vittorio's own deliberate withdrawal from the most exposed operational areas, which Romano managed with the efficiency of a man who had long suspected this day would come and had quietly prepared for it. What remained was smaller, cleaner, and less demanding of Vittorio's personal attention than what had existed before. Caruso said once, in a meeting about the restructuring, "You're not getting out." "No," Vittorio said. "But you're getting smaller." "Yes." Caruso looked at his papers. "Elena knows what you are." "Yes." "She's made her peace with it." "She's made her decision about it," Vittorio said. "That's different." Caruso looked at him. "When did you start knowing the difference?" Vittorio thought about it. "Marin," he said. "About 3 months in." The co-parenting arrangement settled into a rhythm over the first year that was awkward and then less awkward, and then, eventually, functional in the specific way of two people who have decided that the project they share is more important than the wreckage between them. There were hard conversations. There were several that ended with one of them leaving the room and coming back 10 minutes later, because the alternative was saying something that would cost them a month of progress. There were disagreements about schedules and about what the baby should eat and about a decision Elena made regarding the house that Vittorio thought was wrong and said so, and was told with complete clarity that it was not his decision. He accepted that, not gracefully the first time, but he accepted it. Forsyth, the mediator, told them at the end of the first year that they were one of the more functional co-parenting arrangements she'd seen come out of circumstances like theirs. Elena said she wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or an indictment of the circumstances. Forsyth said probably both. They all three sat with that for a moment. Elena did not reconcile with him. She had said she wouldn't, and she had meant it, and he had come, genuinely, to respect it not as a wound to manage or a position to strategize around, but as the correct outcome of the choices he had made. The marriage was over. What existed instead was something that didn't have a clean name, that didn't map onto any gut structure he'd had before, that asked him every visit to show up as the person he was becoming rather than the person he had been. He showed up. That was the whole of it. That was the practice and the proof and the thing that Marin kept returning to in sessions that were now monthly rather than twice weekly, the accumulation of presence, the repetition of showing up, the willingness to do it without reward and without the assurance that it was working, because the work was the thing, not the recognition of it. His daughter was 2 years old when she said his name for the first time. She called Elena Mama at 14 months, which Elena told him about over the phone, with a voice that was trying to be matter-of-fact and not quite getting there. She called Bianca something that sounded like B, and she called the neighbor's dog by a sound that was not the dog's name, but was consistent enough to count. She called Vittorio it for 3 months, which he accepted with a solemnity that made Bianca laugh when Elena told her about it. Then one Thursday afternoon in late autumn, when Vittorio was sitting on the floor of the farmhouse living room and his daughter was standing at the coffee table holding a small wooden figure she'd been given by a craftsman at a market. The previous weekend, a small bird, painted blue, carried everywhere. She looked at him directly, with the focused attention she had been developing since birth, and said clearly, "Papa." He didn't move. She said it again, "Papa," testing it, checking what it did. He said, "That's me." She considered this for a moment. Then she walked still new at it, still with the determined carefulness of someone who had only recently worked out, that walking was an option across the room to him, and held out the wooden bird. Took it. She looked at him to see that he understood, that he was holding it correctly, that the transfer was complete and registered. Then she turned around and walked back to the coffee table. He sat on the floor of the farmhouse with a small blue bird in his hand and looked at the back of his daughter's head as she went about the serious business of her afternoon. Elena was in the kitchen. He could hear her moving around, the particular sound of her in her own house, the press of a cabinet, water running, the quiet of someone at home in themselves, in a way she hadn't been when she was in his. Thought about the ring. He still had it. It was in a drawer in his study now, no longer in his pocket. He had stopped carrying it at around 6 months when Moran asked him one session what he was holding on to, and he had taken it out and looked at it and understood, for the first time, that carrying it was a form of not letting the marriage be over. He had put it in the drawer the same night. It was still there. He hadn't thrown it away. He wasn't sure he ever would. It was the record of something that had been real and had ended and deserved to be remembered accurately, neither as something purely lost, nor as something he was still waiting to recover. Elena came to the doorway of the living room with a cup of tea. She looked at him on the floor and at the bird in his hand. She gave it to you, Elena said. For a minute. Elena looked at her daughter, who was now apparently engaged in an important negotiation with the coffee table. She doesn't give that bird to people. I know, he said. Elena looked at him. Something in her expression not soft exactly, not hard. The expression of a woman who was continually updating her understanding of a situation she had never expected to be in and was doing it honestly. She went back to the kitchen. He sat on the floor a while longer. The garden at the farmhouse was Elena's. She had planted things along the fence through the first spring, and into the summer he didn't know most of what they were, and he didn't ask, because the garden was hers, the way the house was hers, and the life she had built out here was hers. But he knew the thyme by the door, and he knew the small roses she had put in along the eastern fence, and he knew the lavender, because his daughter had taken to pulling at it when she walked past and smelling her own fingers with an expression of serious scientific inquiry. He was there on a Thursday in the second autumn, when his daughter walked the fence line, trailing one hand along the lavender, while Elena sat on the step with a second cup of tea, and Vittorio stood at the edge of the garden with his hands in his jacket pockets. The afternoon was going. The light was doing what autumn light does when it starts to going amber, going long, making everything it touches look like it means something. His daughter stopped at the corner of the fence and looked at something in the grass. She squatted down with the entire body commitment of a toddler investigating something at ground level, her coat bunching up around her, the blue bird in her fist pointing at the ground. Elena watched her. Vittorio watched her. They didn't speak. They had learned, over 2 years, to be in the same space without filling it. It had taken a long time. It was not the silence of the house and the city, not absence, not damage. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of things to prove to each other and had arrived. On the other side of that, at something quieter and less dramatic and more sustainable than what they'd had before. His daughter stood up. She looked at whatever she'd found in the grass for another moment. Then she looked at him. "Papa," she said and pointed at the grass. "Come look." He walked over. He crouched down beside her and looked at whatever it was, a beetle, it turned out, moving with great purpose toward the fence post. She watched the beetle. He watched the beetle. After a moment, she looked at him sideways to make sure he was giving it the appropriate level of attention. He was. She went back to watching the beetle. He stayed crouched beside her in the autumn light, in the garden Elena had planted, in the afternoon that was going amber and long, and he thought about nothing in particular. Not the organization, not the court orders, not the accumulation of everything that had brought him to this specific square of ground. Just the beetle. Just his daughter's shoulder against his arm. Just the sound of Elena setting down her cup on the step behind them. Just this. Marin had told him in one of the last regular sessions before they moved to monthly that the work was not about becoming someone different. It was about becoming more fully whoever he actually was, the parts that had been there all along and had been buried under the weight of what he'd built and the man he'd decided to perform. He had said he wasn't sure he knew who that person was. She had said, "Yes, you do. You're learning him right now." He looked at his daughter examining the beetle. He thought that Marin was probably right. He had lost the marriage. He had lost the illusion that what he controlled was the same as what mattered. He had lost a lieutenant he had trusted and a relationship that had been manufactured to undo him. He had lost 2 years of his daughter's life that he could never go back to, though 2 years was nothing compared to what he might have lost if the man sitting in the car on the road outside the farmhouse had made a different decision. He had not lost his daughter. He had not lost the possibility, not the guarantee, not the clean resolution, but the possibility of being someone she could bring a beetle to. He stayed beside her until the beetle reached the fence post and disappeared into the gap at the base of it, at which point she stood up and considered the post for a moment, and then turned around and walked back toward the house with the decisive purposefulness of someone who had concluded one investigation and was ready to begin the next. Straightened up. Elena was holding the door for her. His daughter went inside. Elena looked at him across the garden briefly. Just look. The kind of look that doesn't try to say anything specific and doesn't need to. Then she followed their daughter inside. He stood in the garden for a moment in the going light. Then he put his hands back in his jacket pockets and walked toward the door. Time was still in the planner, larger now 2 years larger, spreading in the way of things that have been given sufficient time and adequate conditions and left to do what they do without being managed. Passed it on the step. He went inside. The door closed behind him. Kitchen was warm. Elena was at the counter cutting something an apple, he realized, quartered and arranged on a small plate the way his daughter preferred it, each piece with the skin facing down. He had noticed this detail about 3 months into the visits, the way you file the small operational facts of another person's life when you are no longer the person they organized their life around. His daughter was in the living room. He could hear her a specific sound, somewhere between a hum and a narration, the running monologue she kept up when she was playing alone, speaking to the toys or to herself or to some interior audience that only she could see. He had learned not to interrupt it. He had learned that if he sat quietly at the edge of it, she would eventually loop him in on her own terms, which was better than any entrance he could engineer. He sat at the kitchen table. Elena said without turning around, "Tea? There's some made." There was. She poured a cup and set it in front of him and went back to the apple. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way he always did with hot things and looked at the steam coming off it. This was the shape of the Thursday afternoons now. He arrived at 2. His daughter was awake and available, and they spent an hour in whatever way she decided, sometimes the garden, sometimes the living room floor, sometimes a walk on the road in front of the property that she treated as a serious expedition, requiring the bluebird and her small red boots and his full and undivided attention. Then she napped, which at 2 years old she was beginning to resist but still required, and he sat in the kitchen with Elena, and they talked or didn't talk, and he left at 4. It was not what he had imagined his life would look like. It was better, in specific ways he hadn't known to want. Elena set the apple plate on the counter and turned around. She leaned against the counter with her own tea and looked at him. She had the ease of someone in her own space not performing ease, just having it, the way she hadn't when she was in his house, and he understood now that what he had read as her natural quietness in those years was at least partly the specific quietness of a person who has learned to make themselves smaller to fit the available room. She said, "Forsyth called this week." "I know. She called me too." 12-month review. Yes. Forsyth had proposed, for the 12-month review, an expansion of the schedule, a Friday overnight added to the Thursday visit. Beginning in the new year, contingent on both parties confirming their agreement outside the formal session. She had sent the proposal to both of them separately and told them to discuss it before the review. Elena looked at her tea. "I think it's your call," he said. She looked at him. "I mean that," he said. "Not as strategy. I would like the overnight, but I'm not going to push for it if you're not comfortable." She was quiet for a moment. "It would mean her staying here without me for a night." "Yes, I would need to know." She stopped. Reorganized. "I would need it to be your house and not someone else's. I would need to know who else is there. Not Romano specifically, but I would need to know she's not in a room full of people I don't know. It would be my house. Romano, if anyone, and she knows Romano. That's it." Elena looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon was settling into early evening, the sky going the color it went this time of year, a deep blue at the top, lighter at the edge of the tree line, kind of sky that made the world look like it was being lit from somewhere, just beyond what you could see. "She'd be all right," Elena said. It wasn't a question. "She'd be all right," he said. Elena turned her cup in her hands. He recognized the gesture she'd had it, as long as he'd known her, this small rotation of whatever she was holding when she was thinking something through. He had noticed it 1,000 times and had never once asked her what it meant. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, tell Forsyth yes at the review." He nodded. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression he had been learning to read over the past year, not soft, not hard, the ongoing assessment. Continual recalibration of a woman who had decided to trust a process she had every reason not to trust and was watching carefully to see if the process held. He looked back at her without trying to persuade the expression in any direction. She said, "You look tired." "I am tired. How's Marin?" "Good. She's good." He thought about the last session, 3 weeks earlier, in which he had talked for 40 minutes about his father and had arrived at something he hadn't expected to arrive at, something about inheritance and repetition that he was still turning over. "She makes me work." That's what you're paying her for. Yes. Elena almost smiled. There it was again, not quite. Something near the border of it. She had smiled at him twice in 2 years, genuinely, and both times it had been because of something his daughter had done rather than anything he had said or done himself. He was not working toward her smile. He was not keeping count. He was noting it the way he noted everything now without agenda, because the accumulation of accurate attention was the only honest record he could keep. From the living room, the monologue stopped. They both heard it, the specific silence that followed the monologue, which meant she was transitioning from one activity to another, and was about to announce herself. A moment later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the apple plate on the counter. She looked at her mother. She looked at Vittorio. She assessed the distribution of available adults and available food with the sovereign efficiency of a 2-year-old who had opinions about both. Apple, she said to the room. Elena got the plate and sat down at the table, and his daughter climbed into her lap with the blue bird and ate apple pieces one at a time with great seriousness while Vittorio watched, and the kitchen held the three of them in the warm, ordinary light of a Thursday evening going toward dark. Nobody said anything for a few minutes. His daughter finished the apple and leaned back against Elena and looked at the ceiling with the reflective quality of someone reviewing a satisfying experience. Elena's hand moved to her hair, just resting there, and his daughter permitted this with the magnanimity of someone who was done with the apple and had attention to spare. She turned her head and looked at Vittorio. She held out the blue bird. He took it. He held it the way she expected him to hold it, properly, upright, with appropriate respect for the gravity of the object. She watched him hold it for a moment. Then she held out her hand. He gave it back. She looked at it in her own hand. She looked at him. She said, "Papa, hold bird." "Papa held the bird," he said. She looked at Elena to confirm that this exchange had occurred and been witnessed. Elena confirmed it with the gravity the moment required. Satisfied, his daughter went back to looking at the ceiling. Vittorio looked at his hands on the table. The kitchen was warm. The window was going dark. Elena's hand was still in his daughter's hair, barely moving, just present. He thought about the man who had stood in his own kitchen, holding a wedding ring and not knowing what to do with it. That man felt very far from this table. Not gone, he was not under any illusion that the before was unreachable, that the past could be edited into something cleaner. It was all still there. The distance from Elena, the affair, the neglect, the organization Enzo, Camilla, the farmhouse lane, the courthouse, the waiting room chair by the window. All of it was still there and always would be. But it was behind him now in the sense that mattered, not erased, not forgiven in the full sense of the word, but no longer the thing he was walking toward. He was walking toward this table, this kitchen, this child looking at the ceiling with a blue bird in her fist, this woman who had rebuilt her life out of what he had failed to protect and was allowing him, carefully, to sit inside the edges of it. He was walking toward it. He had not arrived. That was the thing Marin kept returning to, and that he kept needing to hear. There was no arrival. There was only the walking. The direction and the consistency and the willingness to keep moving without the assurance of a destination, because the destination was not a place but a practice. And the practice was just this showing up, holding the bird correctly, drinking the tea that was offered, staying in the chair, not trying to manage what didn't need managing, letting the room be what it was. His daughter slid off Elena's lap and padded back toward the living room with the blue bird. The monologue resumed within seconds, picking up where it had left off with the narrative continuity of someone who had never truly stopped. Elena stood and took the apple plate to the sink. He stood too. "I should go." "Same time Thursday," she said. "Same time Thursday." He got his jacket from the chair by the door. He put it on. He looked at the planter on the step through the window, in the door dark. Outside now, the time just a shape in the porch light. Elena said from the sink, "She told Bianca you smell like coffee." He stopped with his hand on the door. "Bianca thought it was a complaint," Elena said. "I don't think it was." He stood there for a moment. "Good night, Vittorio," she said. "Good night," he said. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool, dark air and pulled the door closed behind him. Time was there. He stood on the step for just a moment, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing the evening air that smelled like autumn and turned earth and the faint green of the herb beside him. Then he walked to his car. He drove back toward the city in the dark, the road unwinding ahead of him in the headlights, the fields on either side going black, the city lights eventually rising in the distance, the way they always did, steady, indifferent, burning against whatever dark surrounded them. He drove, and he was not happy in the simple sense of the word. He was not healed. He was not absolved. He was a man with a complicated history, driving home from 2 hours with his daughter, and tomorrow he would go to his office and manage what remained of what he had built. And Thursday he would drive back up this road, and somewhere in that repetition, in the ordinary unspectacular accumulation of it, was the only answer he had found to the question of what kind of man he was going to be. Not a good man, clean and simple. Just a man who kept showing up, who held the bird correctly, who drove home in the dark and came back.